Hi, my name is Mark D. Copoulos, and I'm a Philadelphia criminal defense and real estate lawyer. And today I would like to talk a little bit about defending against a protection from abuse that's been filed. A protection from abuse order has lasting implications on anybody's life. If a PFA has been filed against you, you need to relinquish your firearms oftentimes. If a PFA has been filed, it may result in an immediate eviction. And if the individual who the PFA is filed against comes anywhere near the complainant, they could be charged with contempt for violation of PFA and end up in jail. So a PFA is not something to be taken lightly, and it's important to understand how the process for obtaining a PFA works and how you can defend against a PFA. So one of the biggest misconceptions about a PFA is that the defendant really doesn't have a chance to defend themselves at the temporary PFA hearing. So the way that these PFAs work is one party, it must be a family or household member, goes to apply for a PFA. And in that PFA, they're going to fill out on their petition the reasons for why they feel like they need to be protected from abuse by the court. And there will be a temporary PFA hearing. And at that hearing, the judge is going to ask some questions of the petitioner, asking them, why do you need a PFA? It's important to understand the defendant is not at this hearing. So the petitioner goes into the courtroom, explains their situation to the judge, and the defendant is not present because the petition is being brought in and presented immediately. And so the defendant doesn't have a chance to defend themselves. The defendant doesn't have a chance to cross-examine the complaining witness. The defendant doesn't have a chance to put any evidence up at all because the defendant is not even there. So there's the temporary PFA hearing. Let's say the judge hears the evidence from the petitioner and decides to issue a temporary PFA. That temporary PFA is then going to be served on the respondent in the case, the person whom the PFA is being filed against. They will be notified of a permanent PFA hearing. Now, a lot of people think because this temporary PFA order has been entered, it's virtually a foregone conclusion that the permanent PFA is going to be entered at the subsequent hearing. That is not the case. And the reason why that's so often not the case is because the defendant wasn't present at the first PFA hearing. So at the permanent PFA hearing, the individual who the PFA is being lodged against is going to have a chance to go in and raise their defense. And at that permanent PFA hearing, the standard is going to be more likely than not that the respondent is a threat, that there's a risk of serious imminent bodily injury. That's the standard. And the burden is on the petitioner to prove their case. And if you have an attorney, the attorney has a chance to cross-examine that petitioner, to try to poke holes in that petitioner's story, if they're not credible, to attack their credibility. And the defendant is also going to have a chance to testify and to give their version of events. And if it's a he said, she said situation where one party says one thing happened, another party says something else happened, and there's no other evidence of any sort of crime or any sort of any sort of conduct that would warrant a PFA, then oftentimes that PFA is going to be denied. So it's important to understand the judges, as well as the attorneys, as well as the parties, often look at PFA through fresh eyes when you're at that subsequent hearing because they understand that temporary PFA wasn't really a full and fair hearing because the defendant wasn't even there. So the main point here is not a foregone conclusion that just because a temporary PFA was granted, the permanent PFA is going to be granted. The burden is on the petitioner to prove, more likely than not, that there's a risk of serious imminent bodily injury. And a lot of judges take that standard very seriously. Remember, it's the petitioner that needs to prove their case. And so many times in PFA cases, there's issues of credibility. There's personal issues between the parties because it's family or household members who are bringing these claims against each other. There's personal animosities. And unfortunately, there's motives to fabricate. There's motives to lie. And you see this so often in custody cases where family members may have a custody battle going on and one of the parties files a PFA. Or you may also see it in situations where there's a divorce and there's a fight over assets. And so one of the parties, in an attempt to gain leverage, files a PFA to attempt to intimidate or threaten the other party. So if that's happened to you, if a false PFA has been filed against you and there's really not any merit, there's really no risk of imminent serious bodily injury, you should absolutely speak with a Philadelphia criminal defense attorney about aggressively defending the PFA that's been filed against you. Because the burden is on the petitioner to show by a preponderance of the evidence that there's a risk of imminent bodily injury. And if there's not such a risk, then that PFA should not be granted. And if that PFA is denied, then your rights will be restored. You'll have a right to carry your firearms or to have a firearm if that is your preference. And any sort of eviction order that was issued as a result of the temporary PFA, where you didn't have a chance to raise any of your defenses, will be lifted. So again, don't just ignore a permanent PFA hearing if there's a hearing coming. Don't think that just because a temporary PFA order was issued, it's a foregone conclusion that the permanent PFA is going to be issued. Because remember, the petitioner is the person who's saying that they need protection. And so if there's a valid PFA, that's fine. But if it's not a valid PFA, then make them prove, more likely than not, that there's a risk of serious bodily injury. And if there's not such a risk, then that protection from abuse needs to be denied. My name is Mark D. Copoulos. I'm a Philadelphia criminal defense and real estate lawyer. And again, if you're looking for defense for a PFA, if you've been charged with PFA and you want to challenge the allegations of that PFA, feel free to give us a call. Our direct line is 267-535-9776. And as always, thank you for watching my blog.